So the son of Quora himself, Sean Kernan, asked me, is the simulation theory really meaning there is a computer plugged in and someone is playing us like the Sims game? So I'd say not exactly, Sean, but that's a helpful way to kind of explore the topic a little bit. I wrote part of an answer on Quora about this, and then I'm far too lazy to write the rest of it out, so I'd rather just give a spiel. And this is sort of performance art as well, because as I like to comment when I make a video, videos like this are, of course, types of simulations. So the point that I want to make about the simulation hypothesis as a sort of ground rule is that it arises as a necessary consequence of indirect realism. If we don't commit to the idea that the world is actually our mind, that there is nothing that can be separated from our own ideal internal experience, that solipsism from solus ipse, meaning we are alone in our experience, that all we see is our own mind. If we don't commit to that, and we say, hey, look, there actually is an external world, but the way that we experience that external world is not a direct realism, not the thing as it actually is, but rather there is a sort of transition state. There is a way that information is not identical to the thing that it is representing. So vision and this sort of optical presentation in the form of pixels, in the form of really the way that our eyes work is a good example of what is likely that indirect realism, such that the way that light is represented in the cerebral cortex, and in the Quora article I wrote, there's an example from a murine model from a mouse, showing that the way that our retinae receive light stimuli and then translate that into a set of discharges that proceed through our neuroanatomy to be represented in our cerebral cortex, you can really map that. You can show how optical stimuli end up producing this signal pattern, which is not identical in any way, really, to the object that apparently creates the stimulus. So that speaks strongly in support of indirect realism. And of course, people like Rene Descartes come up in this sort of conversation that when we are trying to talk about reality, and that's really the problem here, using that term to try and specify everything as it truly is, we run into this problem whereby the only thing that we can be completely certain of is our own existence. Everything else is going to be contingent upon something that is not necessarily us. So the simulation hypothesis can be viewed as a necessity in that if you have a mind and that mind is not the world, then you have an interface. You have information which is acting in transition, that is producing, like the object, say this pen or this video, is producing stimuli that is affecting our physical form, our eyes and our brain in a way that produces an experience, but that experience is not identical to the cause. And if that's the case, then really your mind is the simulation. And I love to point out blind spots. I obsess over blind spots because if we have these two areas of our retinae whereby there are no photoreceptors in those areas where the optic nerves are exiting the globe, we cannot be sensing light where our optic nerves are. And yet we do not have gaps in our vision at that point. We fill those gaps. There is a constant hallucination produced by the activity of the brain using comparisons to local stimuli, so areas nearby, such that we don't miss the fact that we're not getting information there. Now, if we can tell that, if we can do these fun experiments with our thumbs and see our fingernails disappear and whatnot and prove that our blind spots actually exist, then that really indicates that yes, indeed, our brains and our minds are simulating the reality that we are interacting with, unless we decide to completely simplify the situation and say, hey, look, actually, all of this is just me. It's all my imagination. You are my imagination. This video is my imagination. Everything is my imagination. There is no way to separate that. So if we're not solipsistic, then the simulation hypothesis arises as a consequence of information existing. Now, that doesn't solve the problem at all. Really, it's just pushing reality back a step. And so this is what I really want to talk about what the simulation hypothesis represents in modern terms. It's I would say it's a grasping at straws for metaphysics. Really, as you've kind of suggested in the way you framed this question, Sean, is there a simulator? Right? So we can either say, actually, yes, you're the simulator. Your brain, your mind, the way that you are interacting with information, you are doing it. You are the cause of your own perceptions. On one level, that makes sense because it's hard to blame any other object. If my body is not present, it's hard for me to say that my perception is caused by anything else. But really, we're drifting back into a different type of solipsism there. If we're going to say, well, yes, I'm the simulator. Well, that just makes the simulation everything. And you're the cause of the simulation. So really, you're just creating a meta state. You're just taking it back a step. And this is the problem we run into. I'm going to start drawing on a bit of paper. That the problem is reality. When you go to, oh God, I just realized this is probably in mirror writing, maybe not. But when you go to specify the set of all sets, when you say everything, referring to all possible things, referring to every stimulus, every state that can exist, really you're drawing limitations. This is Wittgenstein's argument in one diagram, that if you're going to talk about reality, your language, your mechanisms of doing that description draw the boundaries for it. And so is there anything out here? Is there anything that objectifies that reality? Well, there's the problem, because in order for a system to name itself, you need a metasystem, right? You can't have arithmetic describe the function of arithmetic in arithmetical terms. It's why we have textbooks about mathematics and about symbolic logic written in language, written in English, written in other terms, right? And other syntaxes and other grammars, because you cannot have symbols acting as their own syntaxes and rules for interpretation at the same time as they are acting as a base symbolic language, because that means that words describe themselves. That means that you can look at this pen and you can know that what a thing is without needing to have a description for it. The thing becomes its description. And there's our problem. When we look at physics, when we look at the way that things operate, physis, then we need to explain that. We need to give reasons, to give logical arguments that have predictive power, or at least have explanatory power. Why is this so? Because. Now, the because must exist as a meta logic. If you're going to say this argument is true, why? Right? An argument just exists in this sort of form. We've got arguments acting there as substitutions. You know, we could make this x plus x equals, right? You cannot have an argument acting as a reason for itself. You need to analyze it, and that analytical argument is separate. It will act as a meta logic, right? So this is what produces the whole problem. If our minds are the simulators, or if reality is not a thing that is produced by our imagination per se, then we're creating another sphere whereby something is explaining that. And that's what the simulational hypothesis is. It's a metaphysic. It is a step away from our common experience, well, at what we take to be our experience of the universe, and we're giving reasons for our experience of the universe, which is a thing we need to do. Absolutely. Because logic and the fact that you can give reasons for things, that requires an explanation. We cannot say that logic arises necessarily. If we can, then there's no such thing as an error, right? If the way the universe is the way that it was always going to be, because that's just how it is. We have a just so story, right? We have a reason that is being given as a reason for itself, which is completely tautologous. And yet we must realize that when we give tautologous reasons for things, when we say reality is real because that's what reality is, that doesn't explain anything. That doesn't actually tell you what reality is. That could be any term. A is A because A, right? X is X because X. That says nothing about the function of the term. It says nothing about the nature of the information that you're trying to describe. So if we're going to have descriptions, if we're going to have any sort of description, we need a metaphysic. And that's what numbers are. When you go to count things and you say, I have one pen, and actually I got 2 bits of a pen. Here's 1 bit of a pen, here's another 1 bit of a pen. Well, now we had one thing which used to be 1, and now we've got 2 ones. That kind of gets interesting, doesn't it? So every time that we are enumerating, every time we're attaching terms, every time we're using ideals to form symbolic explanatory arguments that give us reasons for the way things are, we're operating metaphysically, right? And when we start talking about reality, then we're going to fall into this problem of deciding whether that reality is tautologous in a way that actually creates a recursive loop, what Douglas Hofstadter would call a strange loop, such that if we say this is reality, how do we know what reality is? Well, reality is actually simulated. Okay. Well, where does that simulated reality? Where do the simulators come from? Right? Oh, well, maybe they've got their own simulators. and we come across what Hofstadter quotes as what Hofstadter coins as a recursive acronym, God over Jinn. Right? Douglas Hofstadter gives this great example where if you're going to say, how is this reason for something, the reason for it? Well, you need to ask its reason. So for every jinn, for every low-level god, for every simulator, you need to ask, who's your simulator? And how would we know? And that's where we start to stumble across the real problem here. The real problem is specification. The real problem is how you attach a term to something. Because when we say, hey, this is reality, right? What we're doing is we're taking our perceptions, we're taking all the things that we're saying are simulated, and we're saying that we know that. How? Actually, it's logically impossible, because every aspect of experience that could be utilized to formulate an argument for what is outside the reality box, right? Let's say it's an Xbox. Let's say this is brain in a vat stuff, right? This is aliens are out there playing our reality as Sims. How could we know that? Every single thing we could possibly use would be simulated. And so yet some people say, well, the fact that we have logic, the fact that we have ordering necessitates a precedent. Now, that's actually logically true. It's necessary. Gödel's famous proof of God, his ontological proof. Now, the thing is about an ontological proof, it just proves that ontologies exist, right? But the reason why they are suggestive of theistic arguments is because we do apparently have ontology, so we can make sense of things, we can order information, and there is no reasonable argument that suggests that ordering comes from disorder, right? It's logically incoherent because logic it proceeds from logical precursors, from precedents. And so if your precedent is, actually, we started off with something that's not logical, well, you can't get logic from that. You cannot have a universe that is causeless, disordered, that has no logos. This is the old Greek word from which we get logic. And that logos referred to a necessary reason, a cause which actually is propagating, right? And actually that's the word that John's gospel begins with. In the beginning was the word. Well, actually that's logos. The word there is logos. In the beginning was logos. And that's why we have logic. And that actually is a necessary argument, because the alternative is logic comes from what is not logical. Okay? And that's pretty obvious. So, when we have ontological arguments, things that show that you must have necessary existences, like Gödel shows, in order to have ordering, right? You need to have an ordering precedent in order to have your argument progress. Well, that indicates a creative intelligence, a form of structuring which is intentional. And that's the other part to the simulation hypothesis, that if we have this unreasonable efficiency of mathematics, we have this fine-tuning of the universe, we have these things which just seem to not be random. And if we are going to talk about randomness, boy, it gets a bit weird for the product of a random universe, namely my brain here slightly on fire, describing that universe as random. That again is essentially incoherent. It's essentially contradictory. A causeless, unintentional universe created an intentional, resulted in a being that is an intentional being that searches for causes. Yeah, that's absurd. And as I like to say, if we take absurdism seriously, then we can't. Because absurdism doesn't exist either. So we end up in this trap of logic where, because we can do ordering, because we have reason, and we cannot see a clear reason for why our reasoning should be independent of everything else. We don't want to commit to solipsism. We don't want to say, actually, all of this is my imagination and I'm a deluded God that doesn't realize what it is. Well, then we run into this problem where we have to create metaphysics that necessitate their own metaphysics, and we ask the question, what's simulating what, simulating what, simulating what, simulating what? And in order to have any sort of answer for that, we really have to invoke what is old school theism. Now, some people at this point say, well, no, you can have systems that simulate themselves. Look at a computer that's running simpler programs. It can't simulate itself, right? We can have simulations running within simulations. Absolutely, that's fine. That's all I'm saying with this infinite regress. Whoop. But at the same time, you cannot have, again, denomination acting internally. You can't have reality calling itself reality, because the calling itself is the problem. That, in computational language, really, that's a loop. And we run into the halting problem. We run into the situation where if something is calling on itself in order to interrogate its own activity, you're going to loop. You can't have a code looking for a code to read a code that is itself. That's a loop, and that has no explanatory power. Okay? So, hence the simulation hypothesis arises from the nature of information, from the nature of logic, and our need to explain our ability to explain things. Really, it's old school theism given new words, and it's a problem which begets itself infinitely. Is it the same as playing The Sims? Nope. Only if the Sims are people and we're their simulators, and we have an infinite regress behind us and an infinite regress before us. Hope that's some help, and check out the paper about mouse optics, which I think is kind of cool.